Hello everyone. Today I am testing blue and green watercolor paints for intuitive painting. This one turned into a little bit of a mess. In my previous videos, I tested red watercolor paints and yellow watercolor paints with a few browns, and today I am going to figure out my greens and blues. Normally, I don't paint with straight green. On the acrylic side, I usually just mix the greens myself. But for one of my upcoming intuitive paintings for my artist grant project, I'm looking for a tealish blue-green color, something close to phthalo. So I want to test a few greens to see which one might work as a placeholder color. I also have a random violet watercolor paint that I'm not really sure if it's actually purple or not, so I'm going to test that out today too. I've got Sap Green, Intense Green, Permanent Green Deep, Viridian Green, Cobalt Blue, Ultramarine Blue, and Violet. I also have two different brands of Ultramarine Blue, so I'm going to just test both of them to see what they look like. Just kind of playing around to see what these paints actually look like when they hit the paper. As with my previous watercolor tests, I'm putting about a pea-sized drop of each paint into the little reaction wells. Now, in a normal YouTube video, they might cut out mistakes, but I'm showing you the permanent green deep turns into a little bit of a disaster. This paint is everywhere. It's in the cap, all over the tube, and all over my hands. So today's adventure is Mary makes a paint mess. But that's part of learning watercolor and painting as well. Some of these paints are thicker, some of them are runnier, and some separate differently. Some apparently try to escape the tube entirely. Now, the Viridian Green, as it's coming out of the tube, it actually looks like the closest to the teal color that I'm looking for. So if this keeps working for the rest of this video, then I might be using this as my placeholder for future intuitive painting washes. Next up is Cobalt Blue, which I've used quite a bit for previous intuitive paintings. Um, I don't generally use Cobalt Blue as a watercolor paint, um, and I don't really have a Cobalt Blue in acrylic either. So I would like to see how this reacts just from a water standpoint. We also look at those two ultramarine blues. So one is Fine Touch brand, the other is Master Color or Master's Touch brand. At a first glance, just coming out of the tube, they look almost identical. And then finally we have the violet. As I did with the yellow watercolor testing, I'm just putting the straight pigment onto the dry paper to see what it looks like. Sap green is definitely a warm green. It feels very tree-like, very earthy, very natural. If I were painting a traditional watercolor landscape, I could definitely see the sap green being used for trees or foliage. The intense green immediately reads as a cool green. Permanent green deep feels almost neutral to me, maybe cool, maybe slightly muted. And then the Viridian Green is absolutely the closest to the phthalo color I was looking for. It's definitely the strongest contender for my upcoming painting idea. Next, we'll move into the Cobalt Blue, which is kind of chunky compared to the other paints. I don't know if that's the pigment itself or is it just the tube, but it definitely looks different. Ultramarine blue on the acrylic side is usually considered a warm blue because when you start adding white, it starts leaning towards purple. And I can see that happening here with the watercolor. The ultramarine gives more of a warmer purplish vibe compared to the cobalt. And then the violet, it's actually purple. I wasn't expecting that. I honestly would probably never use the purple, but if I ever did end up doing an intuitive painting that um, develops those violet tones, this is could be a good starting point for me. Now I'm going to add 4 drops of water to every reaction wall to see how they behave when they've been just a little bit diluted. Once the water gets added, you can really start to see that teal tone emerge from the Viridian Green. That's exactly the color I was hoping for. As always, I use the back end of my paintbrush as my watercolor stir stick. I'm going to get the paper slightly wet to test how these paints spread and hold on to their pigment. Right away, I notice the intense green doesn't actually hold onto its color nearly as well as I expected. The Viridian also loses pigment pretty quickly, even though it's still the closest match to the teal color I want. It's definitely not enough to stop me from using it, but definitely something to keep in mind as I am using these watercolors for the washes. Next, we're going to move into the blues, and I'm kind of shocked at how quickly the watercolor blues lose their pigment once the water is added. On the acrylic side, blue is an extremely powerful color, but on watercolor, the blues become soft and transparent almost immediately. The watercolors, or the ultramarine, still gives off that warm purple undertone even after the dilution, and the violet holds onto its pigment actually a little bit better than some of the blues. So even though these greens and blues are already pretty light, I'm going to continue to add more water to get them closer to the wash territory on canvas, so much lighter than they are right now. I usually start doing a watercolor wash and then let the pigment naturally settle onto the uneven areas of the canvas as it dries. Where the water pools, the pigment becomes darker, and that organic movement of the water and paint becomes the starting point for an intuitive painting. So this process is kind of about learning exactly how much water to add to each color before it loses too much strength for the intuitive painting process. And compared to the reds and yellows I tested earlier, the blues and greens lose their color intensity much, much faster. The reds really hold their pigment well, which is true on the acrylic side, and surprisingly, the yellows held their pigment much better the um, than the blues did, which is not true at all on the acrylic side. So these blues and greens, they become pretty soft pretty quickly. By the end of this test, I definitely know that Viridian Green and Intense Green work best for the cool teal direction I want for my upcoming grant paintings. On the blue side, Cobalt Blue actually holds onto the color a little better than Ultramarine when it's diluted, even though they have a very similar pigment color. So I can probably use all 3 of the tubes of Cobalt and Ultramarine that I have to get started. Sap Green and Violet are probably colors I would only use if an intuitive painting, um, like if the goal of that painting was definitely to have the warm greens or the violet in it. Well, that wraps up my watercolor testing for greens, blues, and the surprise purple. Thank you so much for joining me for another watercolor experiment. Just a quick heads up, as we move into summer, I do have some work commitments, family activities, and my artist grant project all happening. So I'm going to slow down my posting schedule to probably only once or twice a week for a little while. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next painting session.